Welcome to Tucker Carlson. Today, our next guest is here purely because he is smart and interesting. His name is Arthur Milek. I wound up sitting next to him at dinner a few years ago. I'd never seen the guy in my life. And by the end of dinner, I thought, wow, there's someone who's thought through what's happening in the world. There's someone with something to say. And we think by the end of this interview, you will agree. Arthur Milek lives in Washington. He's the executive director of the Center for the American Way of Life. That's at the Claremont Institute. And we are happy to have him in the studio with us now. Arthur Milek, great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
You know, you have dinner with a lot of people. I'll never forget dinner with you. And I was struck and heartened that someone I'd never heard of had really been thinking deeply, much more deeply than I ever had, about where the country is going and about how to fix it. So thank you for doing this. So for our viewers who aren't familiar with you, and you eschew TV generally, so that probably be most of them, give us your story. Where are you from? Where were you educated? How did you get to where you are now?
Well, very simple story. I was born in Russia. I was brought
that's
here.
not a simple story.
Well, I was brought here as, you know, a little boy in a shoebox by my parents from Moscow. We immigrated to Atlanta, Georgia. There are a lot of Russians there, actually, that came in the 80s, escaping the Soviet Union. And then, let me just fast forward many years. Then I went to college, and I discovered teachers that could teach me great books. It's not enough to just have great books. You don't know how to read them.
Where'd you go to college?
At Emory University.
Yes, in Atlanta.
And I was blessed to find wonderful teachers that taught me to read these books. And the reason that matters is that, you know, in democracy, all you have is basically public opinion. You have no past. I mean, we don't remember what happened 10 years ago.
Right.
And so all you have to compare your own life against is what you see directly before you, or the kind of propaganda images given to you. And books are the opposite. They give you the most intelligent opinions from the past. Great books, anyways, not bad books, that help you understand what you are and what your purpose is.
So purely by reading books assigned to you by college professors, it's hard even to imagine this was once the case in America, speaking of a changing country. But your life changed and your views changed. What were some of the books that you were assigned?
Yeah, well, the first one, I think a lot of people were woken up by it. Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. You know, it's a work by probably the greatest book written in the past 50 years that articulates what happened to America through the prism of higher ed. But he was just an entrance point into other unbelievable books. Shakespeare, Jane Austen, and then you go deeper and you find the ancients. You find Plato, Aristotle, Aristophanes, and it's one of the most beautiful experiences that you can have, namely seeing with the same things with a genius. And it transforms you. And it's regrettably the precise kind of experience that is being undermined, taken away from young, deserving kids. You know, deserving because they have the intellect to go further and to excel, but also because they have genuine curiosity. A lot of people don't have curiosity.
That's right.
You know, they just are sponges that absorb whatever's given to them and never think through any of the opinions handed to them. But for those that have real curiosity, that really want to understand themselves, the world, those books are the only way.
So what were the conclusions, having read a bunch of these books in college, that you reached?
Well, I don't know if there's just one conclusion, but what you get is liberation from the immediate, liberation from the propaganda, liberation from all of the opinions that you're told you must hold to be a good, decent person. Now look, to some degree, some of those opinions may be true and good, but the exercise of thinking through these things and seeing in a more penetrating way helps greatly, and it changes the course of your life. And not just, you know, in a career course, which is the only way we think about a course of life, but internally.
So maybe the key insight is the menu of opinions that is served up to us every day is not our only option.
Yes, and there were other times. And other times may have had more interesting people in them that thought more deeply, that were more penetrating. Also, maybe there were other times where there was more happiness. That seems to be pretty clear in certain regards, where human nature was more fulfilled. And so by seeing that, you can, again, compare it to your current circumstance. And this, of course, is why there's this constant low-grade drumbeat to get away from these kinds of books. Part of it is just due to ignorance, because you really need to learn how to read these books. But
Right.
part of it is because, the kind of so-called intellectuals that dominate the academy know that those books are dangerous. Know that those books teach you things that totally contradict the dogmas of today. Not in a radical way, but in a way that just shows the lie,
So you said there were other times, one of the conclusions you reached, there were other times in human history in which people had greater levels of happiness because, as you put it, human nature was being fulfilled. Give us an example of that?
Yeah.
And what do you mean?
Yeah. Well, a part of that is that I think when you look at, some of these ancient histories, especially Thucydides, you see that there were people that belonged to a city that had genuine ambitions and that actually ruled themselves. And in many regards, that is a form of fulfillment of human nature, to genuinely rule, not in a tyrannical way. These were democracies. Athens was a democracy, in a way that we don't have. We have become more and more private beings. We don't rule politically. I mean, the country is ruled on our behalf.
Right.
And not just by the structure of the Constitution that it's a representative democracy. It's not just that. But because there are bureaucracies, there's a political class that rules on your behalf and basically says, well, this country doesn't really belong to you. And thank you for voting one way or another, but we're going to do the business of ruling. Also, there were religious eras where certain parts of the human soul were more fulfilled. We certainly don't live in one of those. But we did, up until not long ago, at least have a happy private sphere. We had families. We had devotion. We had the raising of kids whom we loved. And that also is degrading more and more, is being dismantled. And so what you would ask, if you game this trend out, what you would ask are Americans really left with if they don't have politics, they don't have religion, and they don't even have a family life anymore. And it's not a happy circumstance.
So what is the answer? Consumer goods, or what is the answer?
Yeah, it would have to be. It's not even just consumer goods. It would just have to be some kind of relentless titillation. The movies, the music, the drugs, all of that. But even that's not enough. It's not enough because everybody feels somehow that leads to unhappiness, and so there have to be created these new industries to reassure you that this is indeed happiness, or to give you, a psychological medication to just shut off those thoughts. And there are industries, enormous industries with vested interests that now exist that cannot be questioned. It's science, after all, that are meant to reassure you that, no, you are happy, actually. The therapy, the psychiatrists. And it can't go on like that. Everybody knows that. So
so that idea is an interesting one right there. There are industries in the United States whose purpose is to convince you, despite the evidence, that you are in fact happy, you are satisfied, don't ask for more.
Yes, or to lie on your behalf, to make excuses on your behalf, to say, no, you didn't mistreat your parents. They mistreated you. As it turns out, all of your unhappiness that stems from some terrible thing like divorce, for example. Your kids would have been like this anyways. You made the right decision in getting a divorce. And we will give you 25 different arguments that you can recite to yourself to say that there's nothing wrong with what you've done. And look, it's hard not to be sympathetic with the people that go through these kinds of family dissolutions, just in the example that we're using. But the only way to get some clarity is to think through the circumstance.
Right.
Rather than these things being pounded into your brain, combined with the medication.
So even in, I don't know how old you are, but much younger than I am.
35.
35. So in your relatively short adult life, the use of medication, medication designed to change your emotions, has risen dramatically. What does that tell us?
Well, you have to look at the circumstances into which people are driven so that they turn to these kinds of things. And you just look at the circumstance of, kind of average cosmopolitan 35-year-old, male and female, but I think especially female. I think that these circumstances are really much crueler on women than they are on men, regrettably. And what you see is you grew up in one place, you had friends there, then you moved out of your home, you went to another place, to college, then you had little friends there, then you moved to a big city, then to another big city, then to another big city. You're 40 years old now. You have a kind of mid-career position. It leads to no happiness. You have no real friends. I mean, you have groups of friends from different cities with whom you amused yourself, and you end up with not all together very much, and the prospects don't look very good. And you've been propagandized by things like Sex and the City. You've been propagandized by the therapists. And you kind of succumb to these things. It's too painful to look at the life decisions and how one might have gone wrong. It's too painful because at that stage of life, it's almost impossible to just rebuild friendships. I mean, I have friends, you have friends with whom you grew up.
Yes.
That you deeply love, with whom you actually share a life. And that only happens with the passage of time. You can't just recreate it.
Right.
And so you jump from place to place, trying to plug up those longings, never finding it. And then they hold out all these promises. They say, we can repair you for these fees. We can shut off the thoughts with these drugs. And then you're there and you have nothing to turn to.
So the process you're describing, the tragedy really that you're describing, is happening at scale, but it's happening to a very specific class of people. You're not describing the life of most poor people, actually. I have to say it, in this country. The people for whom we feel so sorry don't actually live lives like the one you just described.
Right.
It's people at the top.
Yes.
Why? What is that? And what's its effect?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe one way to think about the situation is to turn to a thinker that I learned a great deal from named Rousseau, which is a person that has been criticized by, the right as an enemy. But the truth is he has deeper reflections on the nature of love and the family than just about anybody. He gave birth to Romanticism. He has a kind of argument about what a very radical, specifically French strain of modernity leads to. And his basic argument is this. This radical form of the Enlightenment destroys religious belief. It destroys any belief in a country. And therefore, it destroys especially men, their duties to their countries, the priest class. And what you're left with in those societies as rulers are actually women. They are the ones that end up ruling. And they especially rule through their special power, which is the power of sexuality. And all of the movies, all of the theater become about love. And he says that the problem of this is that human beings need countries and gods. They need families. For their happiness. And when you live in this kind of ultra-modern, on steroids circumstance, what it basically leads to is no belonging to anything but kind of the big city morality, as he describes Paris, of avarice and vanity on the one hand and sexuality on the other hand. And vanity for him is a very important concept. And what it means is you live in the eyes of others. Other people define what you think of yourself. And so your life is driven by trying to convince them that you are something that you want to be. But of course that never really works.
But they didn't have Instagram when Rousseau lived.
No, Instagram just accelerates this.
But that's what you're describing.
Exactly. Creating myths and lies to persuade other people that you are something. But the trouble of that is that nobody actually ends up believing that. And there's no core anchor in your life except for persuading others to believe what you want to be. And this is a very big problem for Rousseau. And he corrects it, he wants to correct it through romantic love. Not the kind of romantic love like a Jennifer Aniston movie, but through deep devotions and belonging to a family, the beauty of raising children, the beauty of spouses belonging to one another, so as to create a common good where there's no individual wills. You know, this is one of the problems of many marriages, regrettably, today, is that people never form into one. They say, well, I'm an individual will, I have my own career, I have my own interests, here's another individual will, and so they constantly jostle for position, they constantly jostle for authority, and they end up making each other very unhappy. They're never blended into one.
So there's this kind of competitive relationship at the heart of the marriage.
Right.
But, I mean, the modern idea is that you're autonomous, you're an individual, and you never surrender that to anybody.
Right.
Even your spouse.
Right.
And you're saying that does not work.
Not in a marriage. That cannot be what a marriage is. And I actually think, I mean, this idea comes from feminism. And I think that there are a lot of people who are outwardly feminist, but actually live very traditional lives.
I know a lot of them.
Yeah. And the reason is that they have figured out that, well, actually, there needs to be some kind of blending of interests. There needs to be the development of one person out of two. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. Otherwise, there are just relentless conflicts. There are jealousies. There's hatreds. There's all sorts of seductions from the outside. And you can't live for another person if that's the case. Everybody wants to live for themselves, but expect to be loved fully. And that is just an impossible circumstance.
So you're trying to think through all the reasons why the modern West is so desperately unhappy that it needs to medicate away its own emotions.
Yeah.
It sounds like what you're describing here, the lie that you never fully surrender to, say, your spouse, is one of the drivers of that misery.
Yes. Yes, that is one of the lies. There are a handful of others.
Like what?
Well, the other is that men can become women and women can become men. Look, we just have different natures. This was known throughout history, always. And it's only an invention of not very long ago, since the 60s, that says that maleness and femaleness is just socialization. It's just fake. And it's really the expression of, this universal patriarchy that we're always threatened about. It's for that reason, by the way, I should say that, the kids' toys are becoming androgynous.
Right.
Intentionally, because the idea is...
Well, by law in California.
By law in California. And the idea is that we just got to get them younger to suppress nature or to overcome, in their terms, the fakeness of nature. We got to just get them younger and younger and younger. So that's one of the lies. And
can I ask you, just ask you to pause right there? I think a lot of people who've watched this trend in American life are bothered by it. They can't quite articulate why they're bothered by it.
Yeah.
But they're right to be, because that is kind of the undoing of civilization and it's the enemy of happiness. I mean, sex differences are the root of our joy, in my opinion. That's been my experience in life. But where does that impulse come from? Why the desperate attempt to tell us that nature isn't real, that our natural impulses have to be ignored and suppressed? Like, why would you do that to people?
Right. Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is there's this kind of very, very modern, extreme utopian thinking, namely that nature should not be our guide, and it can be rearranged in ways that suit us more. Like we do in science, we rearrange cells so that they do something. And here, with human beings, you can do that. That's one extreme branch.
So we're God, therefore...
Yeah, that there are no standards besides the invented standards of justice or whatever it might be. So that's one. Another reason is, it's a kind of feminine fantasy that the world can be rid of violence and cruelty. That if only we get rid of the male inclinations for ambition, aggression, if we can socialize those things out, then things will be calm, and then there will be some end state of androgyny, when males become less males and females become more male. The problem of that, is twofold. One is that then male and female don't fit together. They won't love each other. That's one problem. It'll lead to a great deal of
But
unhappiness.
also the opposite appears to be true. I mean, just as a matter of fact, measured by social science over generations, boys raised alone by their mothers are much more likely to be violent. That's
right,
true.
Right. Yes, their character was not bent by men that could stop their passions and civilize those aggressive passions into something that is fruitful for society while maintaining some aggression, some ambition that is also fruitful for society. The other, just to finish this other point, the other end goal of this kind of refeminized world requires that the whole world, literally the whole world, be feminized. In other words, you can't just have America where there's androgyny, because then you have violent enemies still who are male and aggressive. China, for example, who is not doing this.
No, just the opposite.
Just the opposite, exactly. So it's this kind of utopian thinking because the whole world somehow simultaneously must renounce this element of our nature. And of course, it's a hopeless project, but nonetheless, it does enormous harm for us. One easy example of that is, part of the reason, besides the cynical motives, but part of the reason why we have so much illegal immigration in this country, I mean, to the extent that no other country allows, it's unbelievable. Well, the reason is because there's this prejudice in us that the world can somehow be peaceful through the unification of human beings, that nations don't matter, that therefore friend and enemy distinctions don't matter. And that comes from this female hope of making the world a safe place without any violence. And you can do a great deal of damage by getting spun up on that hope, like what we're doing now.
I want to get back to those are all provocative thoughts, and I think they're likely all 100% true. So you read these books at Emory, you're trying to think through what to do with your life. What do you decide? What do you do next?
Then I go to graduate school, and then after that...
For what?
Political philosophy, also at the University of Chicago. And then I decide, I've been studying Machiavelli. Well, I'm really interested in war. I mean, that is one of Machiavelli's great themes. And of course, this is the time of Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think, well, what better place to do that than in Washington, D.C., the headquarters of where the wars are being governed.
Yeah.
And I come there, and I met a lot of, I met a lot of really kind and talented people along the way.
Yeah.
Though I think that they're few and far between. You get to Washington and you think, well, I'm interested in war. And then you realize that what we were doing then was just war run by bureaucracies. There was no statesmanship. There was no talented individuals really thinking through what is possible and making incredibly difficult decisions. It was just various parts of the bureaucracy picking apart whatever was going to happen, or especially whatever needed to happen. It was an amazing thing to behold. I couldn't believe what I saw. How many people just didn't understand the region, didn't speak the languages, were just imposing microcosms of America onto these foreign countries. The goal is not really to harshly defeat the enemy. Never, as far as I saw it, the goal. The goal was, create more safety equipment, create a couple of universities, do gender studies there. It was astonishing and really disheartening and disappointing.
What did the architects of the project you're describing think they were going to get at the end?
I think that they were just totally confused about it. I don't think that they really thought about that. I mean, perhaps you can, Edward Luttwak said some time ago, maybe you can create a liberal democracy in one of these places, but it would require so much bloodshed, which would be terrible, that nobody can really stomach it. And so everything ended up being a half measure. The most amazing thing that I saw was that the people that were supposed to be overseeing this and checking these kinds of hopes, impossible hopes, ambitions, namely Congress, were just out to lunch. The spending was never really looked at. There was no direct oversight and investigations. In other words, you look at the several committees on the Hill that should be overseeing these kinds of things, should be overseeing corruption, for example. The DOD has 750,000 civilians, and there were, 5, 6, 10 people overseeing that should be looking at various kinds of corruption, checking the strategies, etc. So, it was really disappointing and disheartening to see, and I hope that it can be corrected.
So what did you do?
I left. I went to another think tank and totally changed my direction. I didn't want to do foreign policy anymore, partly for those reasons.
So where did you go?
I went to the Heritage Foundation, where I worked in a little center that did American political thought.
Yes.
Which is, what we were discussing earlier. Understanding intellectually where we came from as a nation, our founding principles, and what happened to us as a nation, and where we're likely going.
So you come to Washington having immersed yourself deeply in the thinking of previous ages. You want to apply that to public policy. You're immediately frustrated, but you're living within conservative nonprofit world, as it's sometimes referred to.
Yes.
So you've been there a while, so you know how it works. I want to play a soundbite from Michael Anton, who's sat in the very seat you're sitting in now, who I think you know, who's also spent a lot of his life in that world. And here is how he sums up what it's like. Watch.
Now I'll name names, right? If you're at National Review or AEI or the Heritage Foundation, your job is to pretend to oppose, but to really support. Your whole business model, well, your business model as staff and management collapses if you don't do that. It's an open question why the donors donate to these places. I actually believe they're deceiving their donors for the most part. That is, I'd like to believe most donors to Conservatism Inc. and our Heritage, whoever, they're writing checks. They think these guys are fighting bad leftists. They're fighting socialists, communists, America haters, critical race theory. They're standing athwart yelling stop. They really think that. They don't think I'm writing this check so that Rich Lowry, Ramesh Ponnuru, Jonah Goldberg, and other fat, useless grifters can have six-figure jobs to do nothing but sell out my country and pretend that they're saving me. I don't think they think that, but just to be completely clear, that's what they're doing.
Okay. I'm not. So he says his summation is of professional conservatism in Washington. They are, quote, fat, useless grifters who have six-figure jobs to do nothing but sell out our country and pretend they're saving me. What do you make of that?
Well, in some ways it's true, but there's actually another part of it that in a way is more innocent and in a way is more harmful. And I would put it this way, that they are terrified of what the New York Times thinks.
Still?
I think so. And you see it in members of Congress, you see it in the think tanks, that the New York Times ends up creating a kind of moral, psychological horizon for them. And they have to play within the sandbox erected for them by those institutions. They don't want to stray to say obvious things. There are a tiny handful of tiny think tanks in DC that would even talk about ratcheting back legal immigration. Everybody else is within the dogma created by the New York Times. I would also say that...
Wait, how does an institution that's so openly hostile to the core interests of the people these think tanks supposedly represent have the moral authority to tell those same think tanks what to say? Like, how does that even happen?
Yes. The reason is because I suspect to some degree a lot of these people just know that they don't rule the country, this country doesn't belong to them, and they're kind of making tacitly deals so that they can be left alone. So that they can do their own little things, their own little issues, which they fight for in sometimes in sincere and sometimes in insincere ways. But for the most part, that allows them to be left alone.
So in order to be effective, you can't be like that. You have to be mentally emancipated from the dishonesty, the dishonest attacks of your critics, right?
And you also have to have a kind of internal fortitude to know what you're fighting for.
Right.
And that's the problem. So many of the dogmas of the conservative movement have left them so confused. So one example that I think you've done a lot of great work on is what to do about big tech. They kicked Trump off of big tech, and it looks like whoever the candidate from the right is going to be, they can kick him off, and the election will thereby be over. And so therefore you have corporations that can literally determine the outcome of a presidential election and therefore the direction of the country. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable.
Well, it's not democracy.
Right. And the conflicts inside of many of these places are really dogmatic internal conflicts. It's not about being bought off. It's about thinking that no matter what, free market, no matter what happens to the country, free markets is the only principle that we can hold fast to. If it means destroying the country, if it means all of the jobs going away to other lands, if it means corporations determining the outcome of election, we have preserved the dogma of free markets. And it's not how a free people think. It's not how a people think that want to preserve their country and preserve their political liberty. So my answer to you is that I don't like going in the direction of, Russian-style corruption. It's not that. It's the mindless dogmatism that people cannot shake.
That free markets, which, by the way, we don't have.
Of course.
Right? It would be nice to have that, I guess, but we don't have anything close to that.
Right.
But that ideal, the sort of libertarian economic ideal, is the only thing that we will fight for.
Yes.
Where does that come from?
Well, it comes from, two things. One is it's so easy to just defend a dogma because you don't have to think. You just apply it. It's like a puzzle piece. It fits right here, but you also force it into that puzzle piece and into that one. And it gives you a kind of self-confidence that so many of these people actually lack because they're so apolitical. They're not statesmen. You know what I mean?
Yes.
They're not fearless. They're just analysts, And that's who ends up running things. Analysts who are just dogmatic. That's one thing. But another thing is, and I know you know this answer, is that during the Cold War, there was a kind of truce, a useful truce, between conservatives and libertarians. But what that meant was that every economic policy thought was outsourced from libertarians and placed into the kind of dogmatic pantheon of conservatism. And now conservatism has largely gone away. In other words, it's become irrelevant. But what has maintained itself is the libertarian dogmatism. And that's what remains.
The betrayal of conservatives or normal Americans, people who would like to live in a country like America was in 1985, nothing radical, nothing crazy, but just sort of what it was not that long ago. Those people, the closer you look, do seem to have really been betrayed and sold out by the people they pay to represent them in Washington. I could give you a million examples, but I want to give you one. This is a clip from a guy called Frank Luntz, who is a pollster. He's not actually a pollster, but that's what he's called in Washington. He samples public opinion, and then he tells members of Congress what their voters want them to do, and by and large, they do it. He's been doing this for 35 years. He's by far the most powerful pollster on the Republican side. And this is from this spring, and it's just kind of a window into his thinking about the voters he claims to understand. Watch.
They believe in immigrants, in immigration. They are pro-immigration. And honestly, I was a little surprised because of what I see reported in the media. Trump voters support the DREAM Act. They support the ability of these people who are brought here through no fault of their own, the ability to earn a path to citizenship. We need these people. We actually have an economy that's expanding, that's growing.
So, I mean, whatever you think about the argument that he's making, if you're looking straight into the camera and claiming that based on your research, Trump voters above all want more immigration into the country, like that's so obviously untrue. That's so transparently nuts. How could someone like that maintain his position for 35 years as kind of the chief whisperer to those in power? Like, how could that happen?
Yeah, because people like this give the easy way out to all of the members of Congress who claim to be representing you or your friends or whatever other community in America, and teaches them to have a good conscience about caving to the regime.
Right.
That's
exactly.
And people are willing actually to pay a lot of money to have a good conscience. You know, we talked about that in kind of the marriage
Just thinking that exact same thing.
And divorce.
You've returned to the theme that above all, people want to feel good about their bad decisions.
Yes, yes, and want to do it on the authority of science. You know, polling science. Look, also, I should say that, I mean, Trump did a lot of good for the country in terms of liberating it from reliance on opinion polling.
Yes.
But one way that you just see how phony, to a great degree phony the industry is not only in its inaccuracies. That's true, but put that aside. It's really what it doesn't see is potentiality. In other words, think about how Trump shifted public opinion on trade. One of these dogmas that everybody just thought, like, no, we're going to stick to it. Public opinion is settled on it for 30 years. The libertarians have won, and the left has kind of come along to it. He changed it like this, you know, over the course of a couple of months. Same on immigration. And so these opinion polls, in effect, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, they intend to shut off any kind of sphere of potential where political leaders can go, which is why Trump was such a force of nature in his own way. You know, he just saw clearly the circumstances, the interests of his constituency, and he saw the psychological potential for going in that direction. That's what a part of statesmanship is about. And when you compare that, those instincts, those feelings, the courage, you know, that it takes to supersede what all of these, you know, kind of grifters tell you, you compare that to the stable of the general stable, with some exceptions, with some good exceptions, of politicians on the right. There is no desire to go against the regime.
No.
And therefore you buy these kinds of people to tell you, no, you're actually doing the right thing.
No, that's exactly right. One thing about Trump, high levels of masculine energy there.
Yes.
So sum up for us, based on your experience in Washington, your grounding in ancient thought, and your common sense, the path to redeeming, saving, protecting the country from what we're seeing now.
Right.
What do we do next?
Right. Well,
and don't, I mean, this is a subscription site.
Yeah.
So you can be honest.
No, all right. Look, the truth is, nobody knows. You know, and anybody that tells you that they've worked it all out is just lying or trying to make a buck. But you look at it sphere by sphere, and there are places where hope can emerge. That is reasonable hope, not just kind of utopian nonsense. Number one is, to return to where we began, I think that there's actually a lot of potential with women. They've been made very unhappy.
Yeah.
And it's really dark to see how some of these lives turn out. And there's great room for older women who have lived out the lies that have been given to them, that you don't need to have children. You can live, you know, a life of moving from place to place, a life of amusements, and that will be fulfilling. They can warn young women about this. And I want a Rush Limbaugh female to emerge that does this, that has a big radio show, and that just talks to young women and heads off those life alternatives, which have made so many unhappy. So that's one area where I think, because nature is, they want to be, many of them want to be mothers.
Well, of course.
You know, they want to love their children. They, you know, unlike men, before they even get pregnant, they already love their children.
Right.
You know, it's nature. And so to stop the industries that are created to suppress the maternal instinct.
Yes.
You know, to point the finger at them.
They're thwarting half the populations or some huge number of people's deepest desires
Right.
from happening. So why is that not evil?
Right. And pointing the finger at them, you know, also pointing out the lies that they tell. Here's just one of these. You know, one of the basic lies is that all of history is just male patriarchal oppression over women. Well, you know, they don't know what patriarchy is if they think America was a patriarchy. They don't know what the Taliban is or what monarchies are, where, males have the power of life and death over their sons and daughters. We were never that. Even Betty Friedan, one of the founding feminists in the 50s, her complaint is not that women are being abused. Her complaint is that women are bored.
Exactly.
They're bored, which is understandable.
So you've actually read The Feminist Mystique. It's an interesting book.
Exactly. They're just bored, So even one of their heroines claims otherwise. There were good, healthy families, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where there was a sharing of power in the households, where women had choices of who they married, where they were respected as mothers and loved as wives. So one is pointing the finger back at these absurd myths. Pointing the finger back at the absurd myths, too, that, this country is today some kind of patriarchy. If anything, it's quite the opposite. It's very much the opposite. In a way, it's ruled by a female spirit, as we've discussed, but that could mean that, well, maybe it's a matriarchy. But a matriarchy would mean a country that is ruled for the interests of wives and mothers and children. That's clearly not the case.
No, just the opposite of that.
Yes, it's ruled for the sake of the interests of young single women and older single women. So males have no authority over their children. They can't even take away the phones of their 12, 13-year-old boys or girls that are watching, things that corrupt them and that harm them. They have no power of money. They can't even say where you're going to go to university. They have no power over who a boy or a girl will marry. So to fight back against the illusion that this is a patriarchy is one of these things that I actually, with a positive message, by the way, that there is happiness in love, family, and children, is something that there's a lot of potential for. But the key is to not do it in these boring, tired ways of showing statistics. The statistical outcome of children who come from a mother and a father family is 5% higher in going to universities, etc. That's just buying into the way that the left argues, but they do it insincerely.
Right.
And we do it sincerely. And there's no way that you inflame the imagination to fall in love, and to want to think that the fulfillment of your life is having a family and raising it through statistics. It doesn't work.
That's fascinating. But before I forget, you said a few minutes ago that Rousseau's insight into human relationships and romantic love changed your life. Is there, for our viewers who've made it this far into the interview, is there a Rousseau book that you would recommend that unpacks that?
Yeah, one of the greatest novels ever written is called Julie. And it's a book about love and falling in love that is written not in these sleazy, dumb, sexualized ways on the one hand, nor is it through one of these shallow Jennifer Aniston movie type things, but a deep psychology of love and what love means.
Julie.
Yeah, Julie. Yeah.
By Rousseau. Last question. If there's going to be change in the country, part of it will be personal, as you just described, people deciding this is not the life that I want, this is not fulfilling me, it's not making me happy. Part of it will be political.
Yes.
Where people who are not mentally ill take control of the levers of government. Okay?
Yes.
Do you see that as possible now? And if normal people are going to reassert control of the country, who will lead them?
Right. Well, look, before that happens, I think that a lot of work has to be done on the level of the states. They must make themselves more and more autonomous from the woke world relentlessly being descended upon them. And to do that, they have to think through all of the ways that that woke world is present in their states. One very easy example that has been discussed a lot, but I think not in the right ways, are universities. Why should the decent citizens of Maine or Texas or Florida have universities that they themselves fund that teach their children to despise them, to despise their parents, to despise their country, to relentlessly rebel against them, to advocate for doctrines that undermine the country, like some of the things that we've discussed? Why should they keep funding it?
Because they have to, because that's education.
Right. Well, yes and no. Education is for the creation of good citizens.
Yes.
You know, that's how you have to look at it. And you can take away funding from these places at the level of the state. And in time, these places will either shape up or wither away. You just need to find the will to do these kinds of things. There are also many things...
I've never heard a single Republican politician suggest this.
Yeah. Look, the right invested a great deal of time and money over the last 30 years in teaching their side the 3 or 4 dogmas about free trade. And every member of Congress and every intern at whatever think tank can just recite them like this. The money, the operations, the thinking needs to reshift at this point. And we can have people trained that can make these kinds of arguments. But it takes some time and it takes some cleverness. But it also takes a pushing aside of that old guard who had an important role to play at one time, but is living in an America that no longer exists.
Do you think in the next 10 years you will see governors stand up and say, we're not funding this crap anymore. It's destroying our state. It's destroying our country. I mean, is there anybody, without even naming names, but currently in politics that you think has the bravery and the fortitude to do something like that?
Probably. I think so. And I mean, DeSantis is on the verge of doing these kinds of things. He's playing with these ideas. He's done a lot of other very courageous things. There just needs to be one leader. Look at what Trump did again on immigration and trade. One person leads, breaks the ice, and then other people who don't have the courage first can follow. They can follow the model, they can follow the rhetorical example, but there has to be a first person that tries this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of hope in other things. I mean, the fact that, you know, police forces stand down while cities are burned, that can go away at the state level immediately. And so you can have states that allow cities to be burned and states that don't. And it's pretty clear where a lot of people would rather live. And so what I think we're going to continue to see, a lot of it has happened because of COVID, but what we're going to continue to see a great deal of is people moving to states that they actually want to live in. And governors starting to send signals. Hey, you, red people who live in blue states, here's why you should come here. These people are smart, these people are ambitious, and they will be grateful to live in those kinds of places.
Yes, the great reshuffling. That is our hope. I agree. Yeah. Arthur Millick, absolutely worth continuing our dinner table conversation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tucker.
Arthur Millick of Claremont. Tucker Carlson Today is the name of the show. New episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on Fox Nation. We'll bring you the show every night, 8 p.m. on the Fox News Channel. Of course, we'll see you then.